Go ahead.
Reverend Master Koten is one of the venerable elders of our order. He's been with us a very long time and came to the US. He's Canadian. He came to the US to train with Reverend Master Jiu and is one of her very devoted disciples. Trained with her for a number of years, and then US immigration did not renew his visa. So he suddenly found himself on a train to Vancouver, arriving, as I understand it, rather penniless and without much of a place to go. But people took him in, and eventually he established Lionsgate Buddhist Priory in Burnaby, right?
No, in Vancouver initially. Yeah.
Oh, okay. And then later it moved to Burnaby. Then he bought the land at Dragonflower Mountain out near Lytton and moved the whole enterprise out there. So he's been a prior up there in Canada for many years now. Since when? 79,
85, 85.
85. Okay. And has been, a mainstay of the order up in Canada, with a very devoted congregation and lots of lay ministers. So, and as I think most or all of you know, he was elected head of the order back in April. So he's come to be with us tonight to share with us whatever he wants to share with us. But I think it has something to do with being head of the order and what he's thinking about these days and that sort of thing. So thank you so much for being here, Reverend Master Koten. We're delighted to see you.
Okay. Okay. Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dharma, homage to the Sangha. In the time of the Buddha, there was a man who was a government official, and he did some sort of good work for the state and was awarded with the highest award that they had in those days, which was to enjoy all the benefits of being king without any of the responsibilities. And so that included partying, and he got inebriated, and it also included all the entertainments that went with being a king, including the royal elephant and wearing the royal turban, etc. And during one of these periods, he went on the royal elephant down to the river to have a bath in the heat of the day. And Shakyamuni Buddha happened to be down by the river, but this man was kind of so under the weather that all he could do was turn and make the most peremptory of bows towards the Buddha and go down. And the Buddha remarked to Ananda, he'll be back by the end of the day. In the meantime, there was planned all these special entertainments for that evening, one of which was the royal dancing troupe. And one of the women had starved herself to look particularly thin. And remember, this is 25 centuries ago. People haven't changed all that much. And due to what we would now call an underlying medical condition, she collapsed in the middle of the dance and died, or a heart attack, or a stroke. The minister, the government official, the man who was right in the middle of this, had developed a type of attachment towards her. And this was an enormous shock to him. Um, and so he went immediately to see the Buddha. And when he was too, in those days, when you went to see a spiritual teacher, you did not sit yourself on an elephant, be a bit inebriated, and wear the royal turban and the royal jewelry and all the rest of it. You got down and you walked, and there were all the formalities. But he arrived, as I say, on the royal elephant and talked to the Buddha. And the Buddha talked to him of the nature of attachment. And the Buddha said, "You have shed more tears related to the death of this person throughout the endless years than there is water in the ocean." And that man realized to the highest degree of enlightenment. Now, the debate that took place among the monks and the question was, how can it be that somebody who has not renounced the world, who is right in the middle of enjoying all the benefits of the world, if I can put it that way, all that the world can offer, can go all the way to enlightenment? Now, we'll put that story aside for the second. Second story. I think you've probably gathered by now that I'm not actually going to talk about my role. um, in the Buddha's time as well, these were all actual people. There was a woman called Kisagotami. She came from quite a poor family, and she caught the eye of a young man from a wealthy family. They married. This was not really approved by his family, but when she had a child, particularly a male child, they were kind of more forgiving, if I can put it that way. As was common, and is common in a good proportion of the world, the child became sick. And Kisagotami became frantic to find some sort of cure or somebody who could help her child. So she traveled about seeking help from doctors, etc. And everybody could see that the child was dying or was almost dead and nothing could be done. But some wise person, and remember, this wouldn't have been an uncommon thing at the time, said, well, there's the sage Gautama is nearby. Why don't you go and ask? And it wasn't uncommon for people to do that. And the usual procedure, actually like now, was you would go and talk to a physician. They would give you some advice. They would tell you what medicine you needed, and you would go and get the medicine, bring it back and get the instructions. By then, the child had passed away, and she was carrying a dead child on her hip. And when she went to the Buddha asking for help, the Buddha said, get black mustard seed. I got it confused last time with sesame seed, but I'm pretty sure it's mustard seed, if there's anybody. And black mustard seed, but it has to come from a place where nobody has died. So she went through the town, and as the saying is, the poor are generous to the poor. So people were quite happy to give her mustard seed. Every household would have had black mustard seed for cooking. And she wouldn't have thought anything of somebody recommending it, if you know what I mean. And then she would go back and So in the course of going from house to house, where they were willing to give her the seed, the mustard seed, but when she said it has to be from someplace where nobody has died, and these were in an era of huge extended family, almost, semi-villages. And of course, everybody had had somebody die. And so in her story, this is, in a sense, the most important aspect of it. She realized that she was not the only one suffering. When people are experiencing suffering or difficulty, one of the aspects of it, well, as everybody probably knows, when we get sick, I don't know about everybody here gets cranky because I don't know you all, but you know what I mean? People get cranky, they get selfish, they stop thinking of other people, they get peevish. And she realized that she was not the first person to ever have this happen, that in fact this was universal. So she took her child to the charnel grounds. Now, charnel ground is a space near a town or a village where people would take dead bodies to be eventually cremated. In India at the time, the cremation were done by lower caste people. So that meant you took the body and you left it there, and if you could afford to cremate it, you did. But if you didn't, the body simply rotted. And left the body, and they went back to the Buddha. And the second most important point occurs because there is the realization of the universality of suffering, first noble truth, actually. And by then, for her, a second noble truth as well. So she goes back to Shakyamuni Buddha, and the Buddha says, "Have you fetched the mustard seed?" And she says to him, "Enough of this business of the mustard seed. Only grant me refuge." And that is the other aspect of the noble truth, the realization that there must be a way. The experience of suffering, the seeing of the cause of suffering, the seeing that there must be a way. And her experience at that particular point is of such importance to our own training, because we all have to eventually say, enough. I will apply myself to my own life and to my own suffering and do something about it. I will not wait until somebody comes along who will explain it to me. I will not wait till something comes along that is a magical formula. I will apply myself to it. Now, Kisagotami eventually renounced the world. And when she was in old age, and she went and sat underneath a tree. And Mara in Buddhism is a representation of anything that can get in the way. Sometimes it's translated as if it's the Buddhist devil, but it isn't. Because Mara is actually in charge of one of the heavens in Buddhist cosmology. It's the heaven. There's a heaven, lots of heavens. Whether they exist or not, I don't know. But in any case, there's the heaven where you don't have to, where all you have to do is think of what you want and it appears. Okay. Mara's heaven is you don't even have to do any thinking. You don't have to strain yourself to think of what you would like. You've got people around you who anticipate it and do the extra mental work for you. Um, and so she kind of hears a voice in her head, and it says, she's having tears as a result of the meditation. And the voice says, uh, you know, are you looking for a man? Are you mourning for your child? And she says to herself, where is this coming from? Like, I know where this is coming from. And she repeats what she said before, enough of this business of the past. So, next story. There was a woman during the Buddha's lifetime who was a servant in a household, wealthy household. One of her jobs was to go every morning to the market and purchase flowers. Anybody familiar with Indian culture knows, flowers are essential. You wear them, drape them over everything, use them for religious purposes, scatter them, you know what I mean. So it was her job to go and get the flowers in the morning. Now, she had an inside source. So she was able to get the flowers quite cheap. She went early and she knew this person. I don't know whether she provided a kickback, but there might have been that to it. And she was given so much money, so she would go purchase the flowers really cheap and pocket the change. Okay, and this had been going on for some period of time. And one day she was on her way back, I guess, or on her way to the market. I think it's on her way back, when she saw, which would have been very common and still is common in India, there's a sage teaching in a grove nearby. And so she stopped to listen, and what she heard caused her to rethink what she was doing. Maybe it was a talk on precepts. So she went back she realized that this hadn't been a good thing, pocketing the change and belonging to somebody else. So she went and confessed to her employer, who was so impressed by her honesty and her having taken the teaching of the Buddha to heart, that her employer said, could you go every day to listen to, whenever the Buddha is in the area, to listen to the Buddha's teachings and come back and repeat them to the household so that we can all benefit from this? And so this is what this woman did. This woman was also a hunchback described. And so this is what this woman did, which resulted in a large number of the people in the household, women in the household, attaining to the way, as they say, realizing various aspects of the dharma. And given that pretty much everything religious in India in those days was not written down, it was handed down orally. Okay, there was this, it still remains in India to a degree, and also is part very much of the Theravada tradition, for example, the oral recitation. The Buddhism we're descended from came basically through northern India, where there were Greek kingdoms in northern India, and the Greeks had no such reluctance of writing down. They wrote down everything. And so the Buddhist scriptures became written down. It's one of the places it became written down as a result of the encounter with Greeks. Those of you familiar with King Ashoka in India, but that's a whole nother kettle of fish, whose mother was very likely Greek, and who wrote these edicts in all the languages then available in northern India. But in any case, back to this one. So years later, after this woman had passed away, at one of the gatherings that they sometimes call councils of Buddhism, and they would gather together all the teachings of Shakyamuni based upon people's memory. And the people who had received the teachings of the Buddha through this woman brought them to the council and recited them. And they're recorded in a particular section of the Pali Canon. The same words that start most Buddhist scriptures, "Thus have I heard," which is usually Ananda, is this woman's having memorized what the Buddha said, and as I say, handed it down to several generations. In the Buddha's time, there was a woman who renounced the world and who grew old and trained herself. And at a certain point in her life, when she was old, she stumbled and picked herself up. And she went to her hut, if I can put it that way. They had these little buildings. Some of them were carved out of stone. And she went in, and this is very illustrative. What happened is very illustrative of the way training is actually done. She went to sit down on her bed. The Buddhist monastic rules say, and this would be particularly so in India, before you sit down on anything, look behind you to make sure there isn't a snake or a scorpion or, heaven knows what. And that you're supposed to turn all the way around and look. And no doubt, even though I haven't got necessarily absolute proof, but I can just see it happening because we've all been through there, where you sort of think, oh, I don't need to do this, you know what I mean? It's only one of those fiddlish rules that are always getting me to do, I don't need to do this. But she did. She turned all the way around and looked, then she sat down, and then she reached over to turn down the oil lamp. If any of you are familiar with oil lamps, that's what we had up here for many years. Turn down the oil lamp where you draw the wick down into the oil and it goes out. And she said when she did that, she called it the great dark was torn apart and all doubts disappeared. Now, the focus sometimes in a story like this, like in the Zen stories of people's accomplishments, too much focus is placed upon the sort of spectacular moment without enough attention placed on what caused it to come into being. What caused it to come into being was her previous training combined with, at that particular point, being willing to let go of the ideas and opinions she had and do that which was good to do, which is actually a very rather simple thing when you look at it. And then the last little story has to do with, what's the name? Sona. Yes, because he's named after her. I know a Theravada bhikkhu who's named after this particular woman in this story. And she, having attained to the way, as they say, realized the truth, was sitting underneath a tree. And Mara, again, coming up to her, says, how can a woman possibly understand the highest truth? And he makes some sort of rude reference to two-fingered wisdom, which nobody quite knows what it means. Some people think it has to do with the woman cooking the rice has to stick her fingers in it to determine if it's done, but nobody's quite sure. And he said, raises this. And of course, she, being wise, knows where this is coming from. And she says, what has a woman's nature got to do with it? Go and bother people who worry about such things. Now, that is the end of my set of stories, which I've stuck with because I've told the same stories now to every single solitary group I've talked to. The important aspect in all of these things is that it isn't a question of lay or monastic. It is a question of the determination of the person and the training of the person. The first man mentioned, as I said, completely intoxicated in terms of the world, enjoying all the aspects of it, okay? And is able to attain to the way due to the direct encounter with the shock of impermanence. Now, how are we doing time-wise? Because I want to leave a little time for questions. There are many, many books written on Zen. I even received one recently. And they're often about great experiences and kenshos and satoris, etc. And people talk about the philosophy of them or etc. But to my mind, they miss the point. They miss the point that Reverend Master Jiyu learned in Japan and brought, and which we received. The point being that the spiritual path starts with doing something about ourselves. That's why we emphasize precept so much. And that, how do I put it? There's a story in the Denkaroku about Makakashapa and Ananda. And Ananda, being an intellectual type, is always thinking about what is it that the Buddha actually handed over to Makakashapa? What is it actually that the whole business is about? Well, when the Buddha was a small child and was brought to the plowing festival. Plowing festival was where the king, his father, would cut a furrow with a plow, and then everybody else, it would inaugurate the plowing season. And big festival. And his attendants, his nurses, placed him underneath a tree and went off to see the festivities. And the small child was facing the field that was being plowed. And as the plow came along, it turned up the soil. And in the soil, there were all the insects and worms, etc. And as they were dug up out of the soil, the birds came down and ate them and crunched them up and tore them apart. And then the larger birds of prey came down and attacked those birds and tore them apart. And this is very important in terms of what training is about. The child could do nothing about this. Okay. So the response of the child, the only response of the child, was to try to be still. And, there are these pictures of the little child with his, hands in the meditation posture and the legs folded. And what was called regulating the breath, but basically it had more to do with calming down the panic that arises. Okay, under those circumstances, panic and overwhelming grief. From seeing all the creatures torn apart and destroyed by other creatures. So the child experienced the first taste of stillness. Years and years later, most of you, probably all of you, would know the basic life of the Buddha. The Buddha was young. His motivation for leaving the palace was compassion. That gave him a great advantage in training. Most people start off in training from the me side, to do something about oneself. The Buddha, which is why it was so unusual, started off from the viewpoint of how am I going to help others? And the Buddha tried every conceivable practice in his day, all the intellectual ones, all the complicated meditations. I was going to say medications, all the complicated meditations, all the complicated ascetic practices. And he was very good at them because he was strongly determined. But every time he achieved to the highest complications of meditation, said this doesn't actually address suffering. He starved himself, he did all the usual things. But then, having, as a result of a type of insight, he thought this isn't doing me any good, this ascetic practice. So he bathed, which he hadn't done for ages. And then, Sujata came along with the kheer, the rice porridge, which is really, really nice, and offered him some. So he got to eat something. Then he said, after he'd done that, he said to himself, this isn't working. None of these things are working. Was there any time in my life that I experienced some measure of stillness and peace? And then he remembered what happened when he was a child. And he said to himself, you don't suppose that it's not, in fact, complicated, that it doesn't involve having to be learned or to finding special substances or finding special means or finding secret paths. You don't suppose it's as uncomplicated as sitting still, letting go in the middle of whatever arises. And so, remembering what happened as a child, he did that. He sat underneath the tree, which wasn't unusual. Everybody sat underneath trees. They still do there. And letting go of all these complicated perambulations in the mind, all these complicated desires for a particular type of spectacular experience or liberation or what have you, all these ideals, sat still. And as a result, there's nothing like having tried out a whole host of things and then realizing they're not going to work. Because then, of course, when you sit down like the Buddha did, you don't start thinking in your mind, well, maybe I should be trying ascetic practices. Because you've been there, done that. And as the teaching says, realized to the highest enlightenment in that night, saw the cause of the suffering. Okay, and that was as a result of clarifying the mind from everything else. So that method, if I can put it that way, that business, that way of going about things, shall we say, that is what is handed down from generation to generation. The Zen tradition is simply that tradition that focuses on that rather than focuses on developing innovations based upon the times and the circumstances, or worries about really anything else. The Zen tradition also, it becomes popular for a while, and like in Japan, the emperors liked it, which is somewhat perilous, and then it ceases to be popular or whatever, because it's kind of on the boring side. We don't advertise that if you come, you will learn to levitate, or you'll see other people with flames coming out of their skulls. You might, you never know, but generally speaking, not. And then you have to do the boring, difficult work of working on yourself, and that engagement with our own pettiness, which we have to look at, our own crankiness. That's very difficult. But that is, in fact, the way in. And it is that which is handed down from person to person. That it is not complicated. It doesn't require university degrees. It doesn't require a certain level of wealth. It requires simply to look at oneself. Anyway, homage to all the Buddhas in all worlds, homage to all the Bodhisattvas in all worlds, homage to the scripture of great wisdom. That's where you have a beginning and end to the recording if you want.